here. We're gonna hang out washing on the sacred land, 'cause the washing day is here. Whether may be wet or fine, blah, without a care. We're gonna hang out washing on the sacred line, in the sacred line still there.
In common with almost every other industrialised city in Britain, Hull spent the later years of the 1930s recovering from the slump. In spite of Hull's mixed economy, unemployment in those hungry years was well above the national average at around 19 to 20%. The dockers were on short time, and life was hard, as always, for the fishermen. Big stores still had some customers with money to spend, and Whitefriar Gate was as full as ever on a Saturday afternoon. Hull's 300,000 or so population could still buy what were to be, had they known it, the last bananas they were to see for some years. The innocuous yellow fruit would soon be taken away to be used as starch for explosives. Ronald Coleman, who had relatives in Hull, was appearing at 7 of the city's dozens of cinemas in Bulldog Drummond Strikes Back. Amy Johnson brought some much-needed cheer as she flew for the first time from Hull's own municipal airport opposite the petroleum refinery at Salt End. But few among the crowds would have predicted her tragic end as a ferry pilot for Air Transport Command. On the positive side, the city planners were becoming socially conscious of Hull's slums and demolishing for redevelopment. The Luftwaffe was soon to save them the trouble. Fascism was on the march. It was that man again. The response of Hull was twofold. It sent some of its sons to fight in the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, and some of them never came back. And one or two others formed a fascist cell in the Guildhall. And one corporation official, to escape later on the regulations of the 18B internment rules, fled to Belfast, where, in the irony and tragedy of black comedy, he was killed by a Luftwaffe bomb. In Germany, where politicians wore uniforms, surprise would have been expressed at Hull having the distinction to be the first city to prosecute a member of the British Union of Fascists for wearing a uniform on the streets. But no legislation could prevent swastikas being flown by German cargo vessels sailing peacefully into Hull docks. No one thought that Germany was bluffing when she occupied the Rhineland in the first act of Hitlerite aggression. Post-war historians tell us now that in the cowardly fashion of all bullies, Hitler had issued orders to withdraw if his armies were met with any resistance by the occupying French. Kids went to school in England for the 3 R's. In Germany, the swastika went to school too. But as the people of Hull got on their bikes and buses or trains for work, Hitler's generals were talking peace. In the old joke, a piece of Austria, a piece of Czechoslovakia, etc. By 1938-1939, the Munich crisis and the fact that the Nazis had been permitted to enter the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia had bought precious time to tool up and train for war, even if the tactics were to prove somewhat lacking when tested in the field. The rearmament program at least brought an end to the dull queues. When Germany started the shooting war, it was based on a strategy of speed and maneuverability, a quick war with a new name, Blitzkrieg, war like lightning. Poland was the first to be struck down, and at that, for Britain, it was, thus far, but no further. A new British expeditionary force set off for France. It was time for goodbyes. There was a generation who remembered the Zeppelin raids of World War I. Most people in Hull thought that the city would be a target again for aerial bombardment. The Germans agreed. Along with other important centres of trade and commerce, Hull was to be bombed into submission, and then Britain forced to sue for peace. As Humphrey Bogart was in Paris saying, "Here's looking at you, kid," the 2nd German Armoured Division at Abbeville was evicting the new British Expeditionary Force, among them a soldier from the 5th East Yorks, and now Hull City Councillor Harry Woodford.
There were about 12 of us in a barn. We were being shelled and mortar fired, and the sergeant said, "We want somebody up that clock tower over there." He said, "I want 3 of you. 3 can set off from here." But he said, "I'll be happy if 2 of you get up there. And as soon as you get up there, give us a blink on the light." Nobody volunteered, because they knew between here and the church tower it wasn't picking daisies. And I was no different from the rest. I didn't volunteer. So the sergeant major said, "Righto, Corporal, write down every man's name in this barn. And keep writing them down in any order, and I'll stop you 3 times. Why he picked on me, I'll never know. But that was a difficult night indeed. No nights to get up, but more difficult coming down in daylight.
The modern port of Dunkirk bears few scars from the period when a huge pall of smoke from burning oil tanks guided the Luftwaffe to their target. It was a time of great confusion and even greater courage. Private George Wilson and Sergeant Major Jimmy Sheeder of the Green Howards were among the last to escape.
Do you remember the battalion flag?
Yes,
there,
distinctly.
so that everybody knew where we were.
Yes, I remember.
Then at 6 o'clock that night we moved out over onto the beach and formed the cordon.
That's it. That's correct.
4 officers and about 100 single men.
Yeah.
Then all the married men joined us, didn't they?
That's correct, yes, I remember
remember?
distinctly, yes. Yeah.
And then the rest who were left at Dunkirk passed through the cordon onto the mole.
We got away on the Venomous
That's right.
early hours of the morning.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's right. Just after midnight we sailed.
That's it. And what I remember distinctly about that getting aboard this ship was getting on the mess deck and finding a paper there with the end written on it. It had been published the day before, and it said the last of the British troops have been evacuated from Dunkirk.
We still had to come back.
I landed at Dover, and had been about a month's walking and hiking and shooting, and everybody was, I only know one vernacular, one word I can use, everybody was truly knackered, and I was no different from the rest, and landed at Dover on this Hermitage ship Wolverhampton, a little destroyer, rather low down in the water, and me in my 5'1", as high as I can possibly be, with my hobnailed army boots on, just waiting to get back on terra firma. And the guardsman, about 6'3", was receiving us all there, lifted me up like a doll, picked me up out of the ship and stood me on the side. I said, "You should have been over there, you bastard, not me." There's such a big man who could have done a lot of harm, but he'd been living it up back here, so I'll never ever forget that.
One thing that did impress me, and it sticks in my mind, will do forever, I think, was landing in Dover and going to the station in the early hours of the morning. It was dark, as you can imagine. It was probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and the only person that could approach us on that station was a young Salvation Army girl with a cup of tea, a packet of fags, and a block of chocolate. And she said, "Now, if you can write your name and your address on a bit of paper, anything, we'll send a telegram to your loved ones to let them know you've arrived safe in England." And I thought that gesture wiped out everything that had gone before. It was such a wonderful thing, and I shall never forget the Salvation Army.
In what was hailed as a triumph by the propagandists, 2,000 guns, 60,000 vehicles, and nearly 1 million tons of fuel and supplies were lost. Between June 1940 and July 1941, Britain stood alone. Invasion loomed. Bull and Hale Sands forts now stand empty and rusting in the mouth of the Humber. In 1940 the position was quite different. These armoured forts had recently been refitted with modern long-range guns and were permanently garrisoned to blockade the approaches of the Humber. A defensive boom spanned the forts from Cleethorpes to the formidable defences at Spurn Point. An invasion here would have met a warm reception. The Germans did in fact take a closer look when an Albatross seaplane flew in low to machine gun Hull Fort, causing one of the first casualties of the war. Had Hitler's armies invaded England by the east coast, in order to take Hull, they'd have had to have crossed the river. Well, the idea wasn't to blow up the bridges, but to leave them permanently open by removing vital parts of the mechanism and having these parts taken by sealed orders to some place on the outskirts of the city and there to have them buried. So the bridges were immobile. 1940 was one of the worst winters on record, but it didn't prevent Hull from organising against invasion. The forerunner to the Home Guard was set up, the local defence volunteers. The railways formed their own. The ARP got into gear, and platoons of young girls and boys became cycle messengers in the case of telephone and communication systems being destroyed. This is the roof of Quick Save Supermarket at the end of Springbank West. It used to be the Priory Cinema. Where I'm standing over 50 years ago, ARP wardens would have been on duty watching for German raiders. If they saw any, then machines like this all over the city sounded the alert, and when they'd gone, they sounded the all clear. Before the Second World War, there were buzzers and hooters all over the city that told people to come to work and told people when work had finished. They had to switch them off so as not to confuse them with the air raid siren. The air raids on Hull in 1940 were relatively light, but nevertheless, in July and August, the evacuation of some of Hull's population began. Just in time, because in August the first of over 100 parachute mines dropped on Strathmore Avenue. Originally designed to mine the harbour areas and the Humber, they were, on land, devastating. The moaning sound of the bombs swinging to and fro under their parachutes was to be the last terrifying noise many of Hull's population would hear. Sometimes they performed their original function.
And we came home for the night, and we had the sirens going on. The sirens were on at the night time. Anyhow, next morning, about 8 o'clock time, we was walking from our house in Garden Village to Alexander Dock, and as we was coming down Craven Street, we had a great big loud explosion. And as we got onto Alexander Dock, we heard that a mine had gone off in the dock. Anyhow, eventually found out that it was my uncle's ship was in this first bay where this landmine had gone off, and there was 3 or 4 barges in that bay, and they all sank. And one of them was my uncle's ship. There was also another ship there belonging to Lincoln and Hull, and there's a man and wife lived on the ship, and they were both drowned.
By the beginning of August, what came to be known as the Battle of Britain broke out. Heavily outnumbered, the RAF fought like tigers to keep the Hun bombers at bay. Among them was Bob Morton of Princes Avenue, flying Spitfires.
I was flying along the south coast, and I was leading 2 new members of the squadron. I'd been told to take them up for a practice dogfight. And I saw 2 aircraft approaching slightly higher up than ourselves, and by the rounded wingtips I knew they were Hurricanes, until they turned on their backs to dive down, and I saw yellow noses, which meant they weren't Hurricanes, they were Messerschmitts. I found out later that there was a new Messerschmitt, the 109F, that had rounded wingtips and a better performance than the old 109E. Anyway, I called out to the others, so this is the real thing, chaps, let's get after them. I turned on my back and went down, and these 2 aircraft were heading for France across the Channel. I flattened out to follow them, and there was no sign of my 2 pupils, as they were. I found out afterwards one of them had tried to follow me down and punctured his eardrums because he'd forgotten to swallow, and the other one had just suddenly found himself alone in the sky, so he just flew back and checked in and said that he'd lost me. I followed these 2 back as far as France, and I was very annoyed. We'd always been told that the Spitfire had the legs of a Messerschmitt, and these two were getting away gradually, further and further. So I gave them a parting squirt and turned for home, because I wasn't going to catch them, obviously. And just before I reached the British coast, they or another two were mixing it in with me. The first bit of that fight, I remember, was rather interesting. I had read in The Modern Boy, years before, that if two aircraft, a British aircraft and a German, were doing a head-on attack, the British pilot would never break away. They left that to the Germans. Well, I found myself doing a head-on attack with the Messerschmitt, and I was holding my fire until I saw the smoke coming out of his gun muzzles, and suddenly he wasn't there. It wasn't bravery. I was just too dim to think of breaking away. I didn't realize our closing speed must have been 500 miles an hour.
Groundwater conditions in Hull usually meant surface shelters, like this one in Warnford Gardens. It stood up to blast from a bomb dropped only 20 yards away. Or there was the square blockhouse type. But for the great majority of Hull people, on low incomes, living in crowded terraces with no gardens, the communal street shelter was the only cover. So they crowded in, with blankets and pillows and kettles and tea. Sleep was difficult, but there was comfort and reassurance in neighbours being all together. But comfort and reassurance, plus concrete and brick, proved not to be enough to save the people of Bean Street when their communal shelter was hit on the 15th of March 1941. A few weeks earlier, young Dennis Hampson, then 12 years old, didn't have time to make the shelter when a ton of bombs dropped in the Dillapole Avenue area.
I was with my mother and the dog in the sitting room. My father died when I was young. And we were in fact watching the dog chewing a very, very chewy toffee. And he had this stuck in his teeth, and it was, we were laughing at him, really. The air raid alert had sounded, but we didn't really take a lot of notice of it, because not a lot had happened before that in Hull. So we were watching wrecks, and then we heard the aeroplanes, and of course the German aircraft had quite a distinctive engine noise, as you probably know. So we knew it was a German. And then we heard not the usual whine of a bomb coming down, but a sort of swishing noise. And I realised later that it was a landmine coming down by a parachute, actually swishing. And it was a landmine that dropped more or less at the bottom of our yard, actually, and demolished our house and the two houses next to us and the whole terrace and the 2 or 3 houses on the other side of the terrace at the front. So it demolished quite a number of houses, actually. My grandfather lived in the corner house at the terrace, and he was killed. I'm not sure whether he was in his air raid shelter or not. He had one in his garden. I just don't know. There were quite a number of people killed, and there were 12 people killed, I think, and 20 odd seriously injured. I was buried for 4 hours, which was an experience. People have asked me what was trapping you, and I don't know. I know that I was lying face down with my head to one side, and I could move one arm because at one time I managed to get hold of a candlestick which had been on the mantelpiece, which had fallen down, and that was about all I could move, just my right arm there. And it seemed an awful long time, but it didn't seem anything like 4 hours. I remember sort of talking to myself and asking, why me? what had I done to deserve this? I remember praying, although I'm not a particularly religious person. And then this, by the way, happened at about 8ish. And then round about midnight, not that I knew, but I'm told, the ARP people and the rescue parties were digging, and I heard them above me, and I shouted, and somebody shouted, you know, stay still a minute, there's somebody there. And it was a very strange sensation. But funny little incidents happen as well. Whilst they were searching for me, presumably not knowing exactly where I was, somebody stood. They'd moved a lot of stuff, and somebody stood above me. And I shouted, you're standing on my head. And I heard the voices say, silly bugger, you're standing on his head, move yourself.
There was no shelter from the direct hit. In March and April 1941, 2 heavy raids in North and Central Hull destroyed homes and shelters, killing 143 and injuring 100. On the night of the 16th of April, Ellis Terrace communal shelter took a direct hit from a 1-ton bomb. The whole community ceased to exist. They couldn't count how many people had been in the shelter. They had to guess at around 60. Men, women, and children.
I got a call out to a case in Studley Street. And this lady, I should say she'd be about 35 to 37. There was 2 more children, and I think it was a husband, or whether it was a warden there, I don't know. But the alert went. And they went into the air raid shelter. And I carried on delivering the baby. The mother was in a corner of the room. The room was blackened as dark as possible. But I had no assistance, but marvellously everything went very, very well, even though the alert was still on. There was no bombs being dropped at that time, but we knew everything could be won any time, but we carried on very well indeed, and everything went very, very well. And the mother was very happy, and the baby, lustrous baby, lovely baby. And then the all clear went. Well, then her husband came back with these 2 children, and I said, well, in this case then, I'll go, I'll be on the way then. And so I got on the cycle and I got to Garden Village. And when they got to Garden Village, the alert went again as though the plane had turned round to come back again. And I can more or less, you could, well, I don't know, but I looked up in the sky and I thought, oh my word, Ethel, be quick. You know, pedal as fast as you can. And I got it, at that time I was in lodgings in Lake Drive. And I went into the ambulance shelter in Lake Drive. I hadn't been in there above 5 minutes when this, huge bang. And we all clung together. We thought, something's happened, seriously happened, you know. And stayed there, you heard the ambulances going and the sirens blowing and, something serious. And then the all clear went after that. About, as you say, 3/4 of an hour after that, the all clear went. And we went in to bed. Next morning I got up to go to do my work as usual. I made the first call to Studley Street. But as I was going along Oldness Road, I thought, oh dear me, something serious here. I wonder what's happened. There was barricades across, policemen, and ambulance men, and dear me, I thought, oh dear. And I did ask a policeman, I said, what's happened? What's happened? He said, I'm afraid it's very, very serious. It's all Studley Streets and all the communicating shelters are all wiped down. Studley Street. I said, not Grafton Terrace, Studley Street. He said, yes, I'm afraid it's down. There's nothing. No. I remember saying my prayers that night. You know, the next night. The little baby would be 9 pounds 2 ounces, and I'm sure it was the youngest, smallest child, the baby to be born during the war. He would only live 2.5 to 3 hours. I'm sure it was the youngest casualty at the war, in all the war, that little baby, bless it.
Heddon Road Maternity Hospital and the Royal Infirmary were both bombed. The Blitz on Hull was underway. From August 1940 to April 1941, the list of casualties rose to over 350 killed and 335 injured. The Luftwaffe considered Hull to be a major target. The April bombardment was intense. 420 people were killed, some never to be found. The raids on the 7th, 8th and 9th of May destroyed the city centre and much of the old town, which pre-war had been an architectural mix of medieval, Elizabethan and classical buildings. On High Street, even the wooden sets of the road were set on fire. One witness to the destruction was Ernie Richardson.
We dropped the anchor at a place called Ferriby Sluice, which is on the Lincolnshire side, opposite to Ferriby at Hull. And during the night we heard these loud explosions. We came up on deck and we could see flames shooting over the city of Hull. And during the night we could see some of the German aeroplanes that was coming over in the searchlights, and there was utter confusion. We saw as the bombs were dropping, we saw great big clouds of smoke and then great big bursts of flames shooting from Hull, and it seemed as though the whole city was ablaze. And you can imagine the anxiety we felt sat there on the ship's deck watching Hull being literally bombed to pieces, especially with our families being in Hull, and especially for myself. I was engaged to Betty at the time, and we sat there watching this, and it was the most agonising night I've ever experienced in my life. And as a result of that, just after I had all my teeth taken out, because I literally smashed my teeth grinding them with the anxiety. Anyhow, the next morning we hove the anchor up to proceed down to Hull, and as we set off, there was all debris floating in the Humber from Hull. There's all the timber from the jetties, barrage balloons which had come down, and all the rubbish that had come from the factories that had been bombed in the Hull harbour had floated out and were floating upstream with the tide. And so we sailed down to Hull among all this debris, and Hull was still ablaze, all fires going all over the place, and especially as we got proceeding towards Riverside Quay, that was all the fire was Riverside Quay. Literally, it was blazing away, and we had to keep a distance from the side to get into Hull harbour. Anyhow, we eventually arrived in Hull harbour, and we managed to get the ship moored up because we wanted to get home as soon as we can to see the family. And as a result of all the bombing, we had to make a detour to get to our house, which was in James Ricketts Avenue, just at the beginning of James Ricketts Avenue. And we had to make a detour right down Holness Road instead of going down Danson Lane, which we usually would have done. And one of the things that I saw on my way down Holness Road is stuck in my memory all my life. There's a gentleman there walking with his daughter limp in his arms. Apparently she'd been killed by the bombing. And he was just walking slowly with his child in his arms and tears streaming down his face, a young child. And that really stuck in my mind all my life, that face of that man.
The city centre, seen here pre-war, was almost razed to the ground. In these pictures of Hull's City Hall can be seen the Prudential Tower, just to the left of the town docks buildings. Its bombing and burning came to symbolise Hull's suffering.
All we had was a converted butcher's van, a bit reminiscent of Dad's army, and one of the biggest trailer pumps that were going, the big Harland, 1,000 gallon a minute job, which required a crew of 5. And so we went on to Victoria Square, and we passed Hammond's in the meantime, which was blazing furiously. And when we got to Victoria Square, there was a police officer told us to couple into the fireboat, which is in Prince's Dock. And we got the pump coupled up to that, and then we're told to run hose down King Edward Street, and all the shops on the side opposite to the City Hall side, they were all ablaze, and we were just literally pouring water onto that for hours. and it was absolute chaos. We didn't know where the rest of our crew was. And then eventually I was relieved and told to go up the turntable ladder that was up on the side of City Hall. And I did that for a spell, and then was told to go on the roof of the City Hall, which was absolutely awash with water, as you can imagine, and make sure there were no more incendiary bombs up there. Oh, and then we were asked if we would cool down the Prudential building. Now, there's a pub next to the art gallery, the Punch, I think they called it, and the landlord had said that he didn't think his cellar was very safe because if there was any damage in the dock, it would have flooded. So he sent all his people, when the sirens went, to the shelter underneath the Prudential building. Well, of course, that building got a direct hit, except the tower stayed, and we'd already tried to help the rescue people get people out of the lift that had been coming down when the bomb hit. The fire watches were in it. And so they said they would try and cool this building down a bit to see if there was any hope for the people underneath, but I had to give it up. It was, if they hadn't been burnt, they would have been drowned.
This plaque marks the position of the Prudential Tower. The destruction of the city centre on those nights was so great that the street pattern around Victoria Square was significantly altered. They got the victims from the basement as best they could, and then they poured in rubble and concrete. Ranks fell to oil bombs and high explosives. The company's faithful dray horses were led terrified to safety. There were over 500 major fires on those nights. The light from the fires could be seen from the Danish coast by British bomber crews returning from operations over Germany. Hull's warehouses were ablaze. So much grain was destroyed that there was a plague of crickets living in the charred mounds. The nights of 7th, 8th and 9th of May had killed 420 men, women and children, some 30% of Hull's wartime fatalities. Albert Avenue Baths was made into a temporary mortuary where relatives could try to identify the sometimes unidentifiable. We're in Chantelands Avenue Cemetery. Behind me is the memorial to all the victims of the air raids 1939 to 1945, men, women and children. After the scenes of uncontrollable grief by relatives of the victims killed in the May 1941 raids, although there were to be large numbers of casualties yet to come, funerals on such a scale were not to be organized again. On the 22nd of June, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The 110 divisions it took on a front from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea strained all Nazi resources, including the Luftwaffe, but the raids on Hull continued. In June, July and August, 300 people were killed, and once again, communal shelters were destroyed. In Franklin Street, over 20 were killed, 17 in Rustenburg Street, and 30 in Waterloo Terrace. As one injured victim said, "These are not shelters, they're death traps." There exists a Luftwaffe report of one of those July raids, the night they hit the gasworks.
Abflug von Deutschland mit dem Ziel, den englischen Hafen von Hull und die importanten Hafen- und Industrieanlagen anzugreifen. Wir fliegen über die deutsche Küste. Wir denken an unsere lieben Freundinnen, Frauen, Mütter und Väter. Der Führerstand wird still. Unter uns die Nordsee. Die Kabine unserer Heinkel 111 ist gespenstisch beleuchtet von den Instrumentenlampen. Um Mitternacht erreichen wir die Mündung des Flusses Humber. Feindliche Scheinwerfer suchen uns. Am Himmel zweimal so viel wie am letzten Mal, wie wir hier waren. Und die Flugabwehr ist verstärkt. Plötzlich werden wir geblendet von dem grellen Scheinwerferlicht, das die Kabine füllt. Sie haben uns erfasst. Geschosse explodieren um uns, Splitter pfeifen in der Flugzeug. Achtung, vor uns Hull, unser Ziel. Noch 3 Minuten bis zum Ziel. Wir sind am Stadtrand von Hull. Plötzlich vor uns eine ungeheuerliche Explosion. Eine Riesenflamme erhellt die Stadt. Jedes Haus, jede Straße, jeder Platz, ganz bis zum Fluss, alle sind hell beleuchtet, wie im Tageslicht. Alles ist zu erkennen. Es ist so hell, wir können die anderen Flugzeuge in unserer Stadt erkennen. Und Wasserballons stehen hervor in dem Licht. Unsere Mannschaft hat viel gesehen über England, aber noch niemals eine so übergewaltige Explosion. Hull hat wieder einmal einen erfolgreichen deutschen Angriff bekommen.
At least one Heinkel did not return from that raid unscathed. Sent north to a supposedly quiet area, the Defiance of 255 Squadron were based at Curtin Lindsey in Lincolnshire. Sergeant Pilot Cox and Gunner Observer Fitzsimmons were on patrol on the night of that July raid.
By the aid of the ground radar and the lights from the fires of the city, which were quite formidable, and the moon, one hoped to be brought in close enough to see an enemy aircraft. And in fact, that happened in my case. I saw it from all the wrong angles. It came across the front of me in plan view, and I was just able to turn and to keep it in view. I wasn't able to execute the type of attack that I'd hoped to do and which I'd been briefed to carry out as being the safest one on a Heinkel, which was to, if, for example, the Heinkel is flying along like that, straight and level, assume that, then to come opposite it and slip in under the wing and under the aircraft and open fire straight up into the engines and fuselage, thereby avoiding the fire of the belly gunner, who couldn't traverse his gun completely to take care of that part of his aeroplane. And that type of attack was deemed to be the most successful in getting particularly Heinkel aircraft. But I'm afraid that in my particular circumstances, I was slightly behind the Heinkel, and he was able to open fire on me and wound my gunner. And although we fired back, my gunner fired back, we weren't able to continue the combat, and I had to break off and come back to base. So we claimed it as damaged. I think we did damage it, actually. We did see strikes on the aircraft. I mean, the night I was flying, when I saw the Heinkel, it was described as a misty night. Well, I think some of them mist, in fact, was smoke from the fires. It was quite horrendous. The fires spread over an enormous area, and you couldn't help but wondering. You didn't have time to think much about it at the time, of course, but afterwards one wonders how on earth they coped at all on the ground.
The German bomber offensive against Hull was not without cost. In May and June of 1941, 255 Squadron destroyed 9 enemy planes and damaged 4 others. Hull could have done with the 12 anti-aircraft guns ordered for transfer to protect London, but she could still put up sufficient barrage to prevent overconfidence in the young, inexperienced Luftwaffe bomber crews that were now flying operations to Hull. Like a site of ancient archaeology, Paul Anti-Aircraft Battery has its concrete shelters and ammunition bunkers covered with earth and grass, but the graffiti of the time can still be seen. The officer's house still stands, in the shadow of the installation the guns were to protect. This site was a hive of activity. Hundreds of troops were stationed here. The concrete gun platforms and the searchlight base are still there, too substantial to rot. The odd accident with anti-aircraft shells falling to the ground was thought, at least by the authorities, to be worth it. 4.5-inch and 3.7-inch shells dropped on Jallan Street and Glasgow Street, demolishing 3 houses. For one house in Dover Street, there was an even more unexpected fate.
We looked up and saw this aeroplane well below the level of the barrage balloons, and it hit one of the cables and the pilot had to bail out. He drifted down towards us, and our foreman got hold of a 4-foot crowbar, and we scrambled over the rubbish, and he was saying, "I'll get the bugger." And he was very disappointed when we got there and found that he was an RAF pilot. The machine we had crashed onto the top of a house in Dover Street, and later on a flat roof was put on temporarily, and as you can see, about 50 years afterwards it's still got a flat roof.
This is the last bomb site in Hull, and possibly in the whole of Western Europe, outside what was once East Germany. It's the National Cinema on Beverley Road. It was bombed in July 1941. They do say that it was showing Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, and Lord Haw-Haw heard about it. There's no wonder that rumour was discouraged in wartime. The raids of the summer months and their terrible effect did at least wake up someone to the necessity of recognising Hull's suffering. And in August 1941, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, now the Queen Mother, came to Hull on what was carefully called a private visit. That is, as opposed to an official visit. Now the difference is an important one. An official visit with an official invitation would have been arranged by the Lord Lieutenant of the county, and they would then have been the official guests of the City Council. On this occasion, that might have been embarrassing, because the Sheriff of the city, Robert G. Tarrant, who was also Chief Warden, had been placed under surveillance by the police and possibly by MI5. His building company was suspected of fiddling defence contracts, particularly in relation to the construction of RAF Melbourne. His firm had received £600,000 worth of contracts from the city, contracts over which there was much suspicion. Here he can be seen showing their majesties around his city. His arrest was postponed until after the war because it was felt that it would upset the public morale. He was sentenced to hard labour, but the sentence was subsequently overturned. As if this wasn't enough, another wartime scandal over fuel for the emergency services was to force the resignation of the Chief Constable in 1947. But the population of Hull was unaware of all this, as they lined their bomb-shattered streets and showed that they could take it just as London could. George and Elizabeth dined at the Prospect Cafe, where thousands of emergency meals were being served to 50,000 people bombed out of their houses. Despite the royal visit and the continuing attention of the Luftwaffe, Hull's battle and sacrifice was never properly recognised until after the war. The ministry rules about referring to Hull as the North East Coast town were so strict that even Hull Daily Mail had to conform to them. Now, why the secrecy? Well, the reasons given are a bit vague. It was wartime, and of course you didn't want to give the enemy the propaganda advantage. But there may be a clue in a book written by R.A. Parker, the Oxford historian, The Struggle for Survival. In that book, he refers to a survey done by mass observation in Hull that concluded that after the bombing of 1940 and 1941, because so many homes and houses had been destroyed, there were signs of strain observed in the population. Now, there was a war ministry, a war cabinet meeting, in which they discussed whether in fact to continue the bombing of Germany. Lord Cherwell, who was a war minister, had actually read this survey, and he saw that if there were signs of strain in the Hull population because of bombing, then surely there were signs of strain in the German populations of cities because of the bombing. So, don't call it anything else but a northeast coast town, so that they don't know the damage that they're doing, but something else. Hull was not only paying its own terrible price, it was being used as an argument for the continuation of the bombing of Germany. Shortly after the King and Queen's visit, in September 1941, it was the turn of Viscount Halifax and his wife. He was the United Kingdom ambassador to Washington, and part of his brief was to persuade the United States to enter the war, on our side, of course. Quentin Reynolds, the American war correspondent, had narrated a commentary for the documentary London Can Take It, and this was said to have greatly influenced American opinion. So a film of the King and Queen's visit to Hull was to be given personally to President Roosevelt. The film, in its polished box, is now part of the White House archives. On the 7th of November 1941, the great man himself, Winston Churchill, joined in a luncheon to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the signing of the Charter of Hull's Trinity House. He was greeted on the steps of the Guildhall by the still high-profile sheriff, Robert G. Tarrant. The audience was addressed first by the Archbishop of York, and then by the Right Honourable A.V. Alexander, First Lord of the Admiralty, who paid tribute to Hull's merchant seamen. Robert G. Tarrant spoke briefly before Winston Churchill rose to deliver the morale-boosting speech Hull needed so badly to hear. The boys of Trinity House listened in awe as Churchill's rousing speech reached its climax. His stirring rhetoric reverberated around the Guildhall. The spirit of the people determines the war, and by the fortitude I have seen today in Hull, I know we shall win. Winston's optimism was, unfortunately, more than matched by the Luftwaffe's well-found confidence in their ability to destroy and disrupt Hull's road and rail systems, as demonstrated in May 1942, when Southcote's bridge took a well-aimed hit. By 1943, American servicemen garrisoned the region in strength. In July of that year, an imaginative and resourceful pilot from the US Air Force Base at Gox Hill relieved a crashed Lockheed Lightning fighter of its gun camera, hitched its 24-volt battery pack onto his shoulders, took the Humber ferry with his English girlfriend, and shot this rather shaky but unique footage of Hull as he drove his Jeep around the city the morning after one of the last major raids. " 1944 was comparatively quiet. There was, however, a Christmas present for Springhead Waterworks, but thankfully there were no casualties. The last tragedy for Hull was on the 18th of March 1945. It was a Sunday evening, 10 o'clock, only 6 weeks before Hitler was to commit suicide and the war was to end. There was no aviation fuel left in Germany, and certainly no record exists of Luftwaffe sanction for a raid on Hull. And yet, a lone Junkers 88, having penetrated the defences, flew low over the city. People were coming out of the Savoy Cinema, which used to be just behind me, after having seen The Shadow of the Thin Man with Myrna Loy and William Powell. Shrapnel bombs were dropped and the streets were machine gunned. The next day, the Hull Daily Mail reported that 12 people had been killed in a raid on a northeast coast town. This is not the full story of Hull at war, for while her civilian population on the home front suffered, across the globe, Hull's servicemen and women were exacting a high price for Hitler's aggression.
Just like you always do, till the bright clouds chase the dark clouds right away. Oh, won't you please say hello to the folks that I know, tell them I won't be long. They'll be happy to know that as you saw me go,